My parents celebrated right after my wealthy grandmother's funeral, convinced they had inherited her entire empire. They laughed as they threw my luggage out the door, stating they could finally erase me from their lives. My brother crossed his arms and added, "Now you're officially homeless." I am Leah, and for a brief, terrifying moment I actually believed them. At least until the estate lawyer chuckled a few days later and asked, "Did you people actually read the entire will?" But let me go back to that exact afternoon. The nightmare started the second the final guest's car disappeared down the driveway. My heavy leather suitcase slid across the scorching red rock steps of our Sedona estate and burst open right at my feet. There was no loud argument. Instead, a chilling, calculated silence settled over the property. My parents immediately ordered the staff to deadbolt the main doors of the $14 million mansion. My brother stood on the terrace smirking as he announced I had zero authority left. The deepest cut came when I looked through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the living room. My parents were not mourning. They were already sitting at the dining table with their trusted cronies, eagerly signing stacks of documents to transfer the estate's management rights. The operation was entirely too smooth. It proved they had orchestrated my eviction long before my grandmother even took her last breath. I bit my lip, swallowed the suffocating betrayal, gathered my scattered belongings, and walked away into the desert heat. Have you ever witnessed the true, ugly faces of your own relatives during your most vulnerable moment of grief? Drop a comment below sharing your story, and let me know where in the world you are watching from. Do not forget to hit subscribe to find out exactly how I engineered a flawless legal strike against their calculated betrayal. Gripping the steering wheel of my pickup truck as it navigated the desolate, winding mountain road, a cold sweat broke out along my spine as the fake images from moments ago refused to let go of my mind. The thick off-road tires hummed a monotonous rhythm against the blistering asphalt, carrying me further away from my sanctuary. The towering red rock formations blurred past my windows, their magnificent shadows stretching endlessly across the dry desert floor. My chest tightened with every passing mile. The sheer audacity of their performance back in the living room made my stomach churn. I had poured my entire youth into maintaining those walls, keeping the foundation of my grandmother's eco-resort empire from crumbling under the weight of my parents' insatiable greed. While they hosted lavish luncheons for the elite, and my brother financed his reckless escapades through the family trust fund, I remained buried under mountains of financial audits. I managed the payroll and meticulously negotiated with local environmental agencies. They treated the corporate accounts like a personal piggy bank, viewing my diligent oversight as an annoying obstacle, rather than a vital necessity to keep the business legally compliant. The darkest manifestation of that resentment occurred exactly 3 years ago during our largest business expansion. We were developing a massive conservation initiative aimed at preserving the natural waterways surrounding our flagship property. The budget was tightly regulated by state environmental boards. Out of nowhere, the project accounts began hemorrhaging capital. I spent 3 sleepless nights tracing the discrepancies through a maze of dummy invoices. The paper trail led directly to my own brother. Shane had meticulously forged my signature on multiple disbursement authorization forms, siphoning off hundreds of thousands of dollars to cover his mounting gambling debts and purchase a luxury sports car. Under the laws of Arizona, his actions constituted felony wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. He had jeopardized our operational licenses and placed the entire enterprise at risk of a federal indictment. When I uncovered his crimes, the toxicity of my bloodline became unbearable. I confronted my parents with the forged documents, fully expecting a severe reprimand. Instead, my mother slapped the evidence folders right out of my hand, accusing me of trying to ruin her son's flawless reputation over a minor administrative error. My father coldly instructed the accounting department to bury the missing funds as acceptable operational losses. Disgusted and completely broken by their complicity, I walked straight to my bedroom and began shoving my clothes into a duffel bag. I resolved to walk away from the empire and let them face the inevitable legal collapse of their own making. I was halfway down the grand staircase when the heavy oak doors of the master study creaked open. My grandmother Martha stepped out into the dimly lit hallway. Her health was failing, but the sharp, commanding aura she always carried remained entirely undiminished. She simply gestured for me to follow her inside. The study smelled of aged leather and antique wood. She locked the door behind us, walked over to her mahogany desk, and took my trembling hands into her frail ones. Her piercing eyes locked onto mine with incredible intensity. "Do not ever trust anyone in this house, Leah." She whispered, her voice carrying a gravelly weight that echoed in the silent room, sending a shiver down my spine. "Stay and help me. I have prepared a way out for you when the time comes." Those words became my ultimate anchor. I unpacked my bags that very night. For 3 more years, I swallowed the daily disrespect. I worked double shifts to quietly replace the stolen conservation funds, shielding my grandmother from a devastating public scandal. I endured Shane's constant mockery, all because I believed in the unwavering promise of the woman who built our legacy. Yet gripping the steering wheel now, the memory of her promise felt like ashes in my mouth. The time she spoke of had come, and my supposed way out looked exactly like a dusty, sun-bleached parking lot. I eased the truck off the main road, the tires crunching over loose gravel, as I pulled into a dilapidated roadside motel. I turned off the ignition and rested my forehead against the warm steering wheel, completely stripped of my home, my career, and the last shred of faith I had in my bloodline. The tires let out an agitated screech as I pulled into the cracked asphalt lot of a rundown motel off Highway 89. The erratic buzzing of a flickering neon sign instantly dragged my exhausted mind back to the events of yesterday morning. Sitting on the edge of a lumpy mattress in that suffocating room, I could not stop replaying the tense atmosphere inside the law offices of Lockwood and Associates. The reading of the last will and testament had taken place just 24 hours prior, right before the funeral service commenced. Our entire bloodline had gathered around a massive walnut conference table, yet the room felt entirely devoid of grief. Instead, a palpable predatory anticipation radiated from the 3 people sitting directly across from me. Mr. Lockwood, a distinguished estate attorney with decades of experience in Arizona's probate courts, sat at the head of the table. He methodically adjusted his silver-rimmed reading glasses and broke the heavy silence. His voice remained strictly professional, devoid of any personal sentiment, as he sliced through the tension and began reciting the primary distribution clauses of Martha's living trust. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded tightly in my lap, bracing for the logistical handover of the eco-resort empire I had single-handedly managed for years. Then, the devastating blow landed. According to the explicitly drafted parameters of the primary trust document, the entirety of the $14 million Red Rock estate, the sweeping acres of Sedona Desert property, and the controlling shares of the Hospitality Holding Company were bequeathed unequivocally to my parents and Shane. Mr. Lockwood read the figures aloud, the massive corporate accounts, the investment portfolios, and the unrestricted access to the family's generational wealth. The sheer shock paralyzed my lungs. I sat frozen in the high-backed leather chair, a deafening ringing echoing in my ears. I could not comprehend the reality unfolding before my eyes. Why would my fiercely protective grandmother hand the keys of her painstakingly built empire over to the very parasites who had actively tried to destroy it? It felt as though the matriarch I revered had reached from beyond the grave just to strike me across the face. Across the polished wood, my brother leaned back and let out a quiet, victorious scoff. Shane shot me a condescending smirk, his eyes gleaming with the unfiltered arrogance of a man who had just won the lottery without buying a ticket. My mother immediately began inspecting her diamond ring, unable to mask the sheer greed radiating from her posture. My father eagerly leaned forward, aggressively tapping his expensive fountain pen against the leather blotter, entirely indifferent to the fact that his mother's body was barely cold. They were so utterly consumed by the financial figures that they completely missed the calculated shift in Mr. Lockwood's demeanor. The seasoned attorney slowly closed the thick primary folder. He deliberately let an uncomfortable silence stretch across the room before reaching into the inner drawer of his desk. He pulled out a heavy envelope sealed shut with thick red wax bearing my grandmother's personal monogram. He placed it squarely in the center of the table, resting his weathered hand flat against it. "Before we conclude," Mr. Lockwood announced, his tone suddenly dropping an octave, carrying a chilling authoritative weight. "There is one final component to this estate plan. This is a conditional sealed addendum drafted under strict confidentiality." My parents paused their silent celebration, looking mildly inconvenienced by the interruption. Shane rolled his eyes, clearly impatient to finalize the bank transfers. Under the specific parameters established by the grantor, the attorney continued, his sharp gaze cutting across the room. "This document is not to be opened today. It functions as a legally binding failsafe under Arizona trust law. It will only be unsealed and take immediate legal effect if there is a formally documented dispute, a breach of fiduciary duty, or an explicit act of malice and abuse of power committed by the primary heirs." He slid a standard beneficiary acknowledgement form across the table, tapping the signature line. "By signing this preliminary asset confirmation, you are also acknowledging the existence of this sealed addendum and the absolute authority it holds, should the specified conditions be triggered." Blinded by the sudden allure of unearned wealth, my parents and brother did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. They did not ask a single clarifying question about what constituted malice or abuse of power. They simply viewed the mysterious envelope as a meaningless bureaucratic formality, an eccentric old woman's final dramatic flair. My father snatched the document, scribbled his signature with reckless enthusiasm, and shoved it toward my mother. Shane followed suit, barely glancing at the paper before scrawling his name. They completely ignored the attorney's ominous warning, utterly oblivious to the fact that they had just blindly signed a contract that could orchestrate their own spectacular downfall. I had just brought the bitter black coffee to my lips when my phone screen suddenly lit up, displaying the name, Attorney Lockwood. The harsh glare of the device cut through the dim, oppressive lighting of the motel room. For a fleeting second, I considered letting it ring out. My physical and emotional reserves were entirely depleted, leaving me completely devoid of the energy required to discuss the finality of my ruined life. However, a lingering instinct, perhaps a remnant of the ironclad discipline my grandmother had relentlessly instilled in me, forced my thumb to swipe across the glass and accept the call. "Leah!" His voice resonated through the speaker. There was absolutely no trace of the standard empathetic tone lawyers typically reserved for grieving family members. Instead, Mr. Lockwood sounded profoundly serious, exceptionally professional, and operating with a sharp, calculated sense of urgency. "Yes, Mr. Lockwood, I am here," I replied, my voice sounding incredibly hoarse against the quiet, rhythmic hum of the room's faulty air conditioning unit. "I need you to listen to me very carefully," he stated, deliberately skipping any customary pleasantries. "I just received a highly confidential phone call from Elena, your estate's head housekeeper. She contacted me directly from a secure landline outside the property limits." I sat up straighter, the styrofoam cup in my hand trembling slightly. Elena had been the steadfast backbone of the household staff for over 2 decades. She was a fiercely loyal woman who respected my grandmother more than anyone else in the world, serving as the silent observer of our household's dark dynamics. Elena informed me about the altercation that occurred on the terrace earlier today. Mr. Lockwood continued, his tone methodical and razor-sharp. "More importantly, she possessed the technical foresight to anticipate your family's next move. Before your father could order the security team to wipe the local servers, Elena bypassed the main console and secured the encrypted digital files from the front gate's camera network. The footage clearly captured your brother physically throwing your personal luggage onto the burning pavement, alongside high-definition audio of your parents explicitly ordering the staff to permanently lock you out of the premises. The sheer shock of his words rendered me completely speechless. The black coffee sloshed over the rim of the cup, scalding my fingers, but I barely registered the sharp sting. I am legally advising you that this is the exact, undeniable evidence we required. The attorney explained the gravity of the situation, echoing heavily in every single syllable. Under the strict parameters of Arizona estate and corporate trust law, their actions constitute far more than a simple familial dispute. You are a legally recognized co-manager of the corporate holdings. By forcibly evicting you from the primary residence and revoking your administrative access without a formal board resolution, they have committed a severe breach of fiduciary duty. They have demonstrated undeniable malice and an explicit abuse of power. My mind raced frantically as the intricate puzzle pieces finally snapped together with absolute clarity. The sealed envelope resting on his mahogany desk. The vague, ominous warning he had delivered before they blindly signed the preliminary paperwork. My grandmother's cryptic promise whispered in the dead of night years ago. Martha's plan was never a passive, naive hope for family reconciliation. It was a flawlessly designed, merciless legal trap. She understood the dark depths of my parents' greed better than any of us. She knew they would not be satisfied with merely inheriting the wealth. Their ultimate victory required eradicating me from the picture entirely. However, to legally strip them of their primary inheritance, without enduring years of messy litigation, the probate court needed absolute, irrefutable proof of their malicious nature. Martha needed them to voluntarily expose their true toxic character and manufacture the very evidence that would be used against them. And blinded by their own staggering arrogance, they had executed her trap flawlessly. What happens now? I asked, my voice finally finding its strength, the oppressive weight of despair instantly evaporating from my chest and being replaced by a cold, sharpened focus. Now we execute the grantor's final directive, Mr. Lockwood replied firmly. I am officially initializing the legal protocols to unseal the conditional addendum. However, I need your physical presence to execute the sworn affidavits. I need you to gather your government identification, any personal corporate documents you currently have in your possession, and drive straight to my office. We must draft and file the emergency injunctions with the county judge before the financial institutions open tomorrow morning. If we do not legally freeze their administrative access immediately, they will attempt to liquidate the corporate accounts to solidify their control over the eco-resort. I understand, I said, a newfound clarity sharpening my vision. I am leaving right now. Drive safely, Leah. We have a substantial amount of complex legal groundwork to cover tonight, he instructed before ending the connection. The line went dead, leaving me standing in the deafening silence of the motel room. I slowly lowered the phone, staring at the blank screen as a chilling sense of vindication washed over every nerve in my body. The victims in my family had always been the ones who worked the hardest, while the parasites thrived on our silent endurance. But Martha had fundamentally changed the rules of the game right at the finish line. I tossed the bitter coffee into the small plastic trash can, grabbed my leather bag, and walked out into the sweltering desert night, ready to claim the weapon my grandmother had so brilliantly forged for me. The heavy oak door of the law office slammed shut behind me completely, severing the noisy, dusty chaos of the street outside. The sudden silence in the reception area was deafening, yet it brought a strange sense of absolute clarity to my racing mind. I walked straight down the polished corridor and entered Mr. Lockwood's private suite, without waiting for his assistant to announce my arrival. The seasoned attorney was already seated behind his massive mahogany desk, his posture rigid and highly focused, illuminated by the soft glow of his brass reading lamp. Resting squarely in the center of his leather blotter was the heavy envelope from the previous morning. The imposing red wax seal bearing my grandmother's monogram had been meticulously broken. He pushed the thick stack of premium legal paper across the smooth surface toward me. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached out to grasp the thick parchment. This was Martha's ultimate legacy. As my eyes scanned the dense, complex paragraphs, I quickly realized that this addendum was not some fantastical cinematic spell that magically transferred property deeds in the blink of an eye. Instead, it was a brilliantly constructed, highly aggressive defense mechanism deeply embedded within the Arizona Trust Code. My grandmother had anticipated their exact behavioral patterns with terrifying precision. The document explicitly mandated that the primary beneficiaries were legally obligated to maintain my executive position as the co-manager of the corporate holdings. Furthermore, it firmly guaranteed my permanent, undisputed residency within the primary estate boundaries. The stipulations were ironclad. If the designated heirs ever attempted to intentionally deprive me of my operational rights, revoke my access to the properties, or forcefully evict me from my home without securing a unanimous formal resolution from the corporate board of directors, they would trigger an automatic default clause. The moment they threw my luggage onto the pavement and ordered the staff to lock the gates, they had fundamentally violated the foundational charter of the trust. The penalty outlined in the subsequent paragraphs was breathtakingly severe and completely merciless. By breaching these specific conditions, my parents and Shane instantly forfeited their administrative status over the entire estate. Their executive authority was entirely eradicated. The trust dictated that upon such a violation, all temporary control management privileges and executive decision-making powers must be immediately surrendered to the unjustly targeted co-manager, which was me. I looked up from the pages, my heart pounding a steady, powerful rhythm against my ribs. Mr. Lockwood met my gaze with a stern, approving nod. He reached into a separate manila folder and extracted a separate, freshly printed document bearing the official seal of the local county court. "While you were driving here," Mr. Lockwood explained, his voice echoing with undeniable authority, "I presented the secured camera footage and the sworn affidavit from the head housekeeper to the presiding probate judge. Given the undeniable proof of their malicious intent to unlawfully seize total control of the assets, the court moved with unprecedented speed." He placed the paper directly into my hands. It was an emergency injunction. The bold black ink clearly displayed the signature of the county judge officially ratifying the temporary restraining order. "This legal instrument is currently active," the attorney clarified, pointing to the timestamps at the bottom of the page. "It grants you full court-supervised authority over the entire estate operations. More importantly, it provides you with the immediate legal authorization to completely freeze all corporate accounts, investment portfolios, and trust-funded credit lines associated with the primary beneficiaries. They currently have absolutely zero financial access." A profound sense of power surged through my veins, effectively washing away the lingering exhaustion of the past 2 days. This was not a petty act of revenge. It was the ultimate legally sanctioned weapon designed to punish their staggering greed. They thought they could simply discard me like a piece of obsolete machinery and inherit an empire without putting in a single day of honest labor. They believed their sheer arrogance placed them above the intricate boundaries of corporate law. I carefully folded the judge's injunction and placed it securely inside my leather bag alongside Martha's unsealed addendum. The meticulous trap had been flawlessly sprung. They had eagerly tightened the noose around their own necks, and now I held the absolute legal authority to pull the lever. I stood up from the high-backed chair, offering Mr. Lockwood a firm, resolute handshake. The oppressive helplessness that had suffocated me was completely gone, replaced entirely by a cold, calculating determination to reclaim everything that rightfully belonged to my grandmother's legacy. The court injunction rested quietly on the passenger seat, radiating a heavy, undeniable authority as my truck navigated the familiar winding path back up the Red Rock Mountain. The sprawling Sedona estate came into view, its massive sandstone walls catching the warm, fiery hues of the late afternoon sun. Instead of driving up to the main iron gates and risking an immediate confrontation with the newly hired security personnel, I veered off the paved road. I parked my vehicle behind a dense thicket of juniper bushes and proceeded on foot toward the staff entrance. My thumb pressed against the biometric scanner of the secondary service door. The lock clicked open seamlessly, a quiet confirmation that my administrative access codes remained deeply embedded in the property's mainframe, entirely untouched by my family's hasty takeover. I moved silently through the long, shadowed corridors of the service wing, the thick Persian runners absorbing the sound of my footsteps. As I approached the grand executive boardroom, a low, concentrated murmur of voices drifted through the slightly ajar double doors. This was not the loud, obnoxious celebration I had witnessed the day before. The atmosphere was distinctly different, calculated, professional, and dripping with corporate ambition. I pressed my back against the cool marble wall and peered through the narrow opening. My parents and Shane were seated at the polished oak conference table, directly facing a group of imposing, sharply dressed men and women. I immediately recognized two of the guests, notorious commercial real estate developers known for aggressively transforming pristine Arizona landscapes into hyper-commercialized tourist traps. My brother stood at the head of the table, clicking a remote to display a series of digital architectural renderings onto the large presentation screen. The images were utterly grotesque. The pristine, environmentally protected eco-resort that my grandmother had spent decades nurturing was completely absent. In its place stood a sprawling multi-story casino complex complete with massive neon signage, extensive concrete parking structures, and artificial luxury pools that would drain the local aquifers dry. "The zoning adjustments are already in motion," Shane explained smoothly, his voice laced with unearned confidence. "By completely dismantling the outdated conservation protocols my grandmother insisted on maintaining, we instantly unlock prime acreage for the gaming floor and the luxury retail promenade. The return on investment will quadruple within the first 24 months of operation." My mother leaned forward, offering a pristine, shark-like smile to the lead investor. Martha was a visionary for her time, but her attachment to the local ecology was severely stunting the property's true financial potential. Now that the estate is entirely under our jurisdiction, we are aggressively pivoting toward maximum profitability. The pieces of their meticulously crafted puzzle slammed together in my mind with sickening clarity. Their overwhelming desperation to throw me out of the house immediately after the funeral was never just about personal spite or petty familial dominance. It was a highly coordinated strategic business maneuver. I was the primary obstacle. As the legally designated co-manager and the fiercely loyal protector of Martha's ecological vision, I would have fought this casino development with every legal avenue available. They needed to orchestrate my removal, strip my executive access, and lock me out of the corporate network before these high-stakes meetings commenced. They truly believed they had successfully cleared the path to bulldoze my grandmother's legacy and replace it with a monument to their own greed. A heavy, suffocating anger swelled in my chest, threatening to completely overwhelm my senses. But as my fingers brushed against the thick, legally binding parchment of the emergency injunction resting inside my leather bag, the fiery rage instantly crystallized into a terrifying, icy composure. They were actively selling an empire they no longer legally controlled. They were making grand, multi-million-dollar promises based on a foundation of severe trust violations and fraudulent authority. I tightened my grip on the polished brass handle of the boardroom door. I did not need to scream, cry, or beg for my rightful place within this family. I simply needed to let the full, devastating weight of the law crash down upon their fragile house of cards. Taking a slow, steady breath, I pushed the heavy wooden doors wide open and stepped out of the shadows. The animated discussion regarding projected profit margins instantly dissolved into a dead silence the moment I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the grand boardroom. Every head at the polished oak table snapped in my direction, their expressions freezing midway through their triumphant smiles. Shane was the first to recover from the sheer shock. He violently pushed his ergonomic leather chair back the legs, screeching harshly against the marble floor. He slammed his palms onto the tabletop, his face flushing with a volatile mix of embarrassment and genuine rage. "What the hell are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice echoing loudly across the expansive room. "You were legally evicted. I am calling estate security right now to have you physically dragged off this property for trespassing." My mother gasped, her face draining of color as she dramatically clutched her silk scarf, while my father quickly stood up, his chair tipping backward, attempting to offer a frantic, desperate apology to the bewildered developers for the sudden interruption. I did not flinch. I completely ignored my brother's frantic shouting and walked with measured, deliberate steps straight toward the center of the room. The oppressive, icy composure radiating from me seemed to paralyze the air. I bypassed my parents entirely, not even affording them a passing glance, and stopped directly in front of the lead real estate investor sitting rigidly at the head of the table. Without uttering a single word, I reached into my leather bag, retrieved the crisp legal document bearing the bold ink signature of the county judge, and slapped the emergency injunction flat onto the table. The sharp smack of the paper hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot. Before anyone could fully process the prominent judicial seal, the boardroom doors opened wider, revealing a tall, distinguished figure. Arthur Vance, the corporate syndicate's veteran chief financial officer and my grandmother's most fiercely loyal confidant, stepped into the room. He carried a sleek tablet and wore an expression of absolute, unyielding professionalism. Arthur had silently tolerated my family's staggering arrogance for years, managing the books while waiting patiently for Martha's final directive to be activated. He adjusted his glasses completely, ignoring my father's confused stammering, and directed his attention exclusively to the visiting developers. "Gentlemen," Arthur announced, his tone entirely devoid of any warmth. "As the acting fiduciary overseer of this corporation, it is my legal obligation to inform you that a formal court order has just been executed. The individuals you are currently negotiating with possess absolutely zero legal authority over this estate." Shane let out a derisive, panicked laugh, aggressively reaching into his tailored suit pocket for his smartphone. "Arthur, you are stepping way out of line. You are officially fired. You can pack up your desk and get off my property right now." The chief financial officer did not even blink. Under the emergency injunction authorized by the probate court, Arthur continued, his voice effortlessly slicing through my brother's empty threats, "all corporate access banking privileges and executive voting rights previously held by your family have been immediately and permanently revoked. Furthermore, the banking institutions have locked down all associated trust accounts. You cannot authorize a land survey, let alone finance a multi-million-dollar commercial casino development." To visually solidify his statement, Arthur swiped a command on his tablet. Across the room, Shane's glowing presentation monitor suddenly went pitch black, abruptly replacing the grotesque casino renderings with a bold red corporate system lockout notification. Commercial real estate investors are apex predators. They possess an acute, highly trained instinct for legal instability. A contested estate heavily bound by an emergency judicial freeze represented a massive toxic liability. They operated strictly on guaranteed returns, and a sudden transfer of power enforced by a judge meant this land would be tangled in red tape for years. The lead developer did not ask for an explanation, nor did he demand an apology from my family. He simply closed his expensive leather portfolio with a sharp, decisive snap, stood up, and buttoned his tailored suit jacket. His associates immediately mirrored his actions silently and swiftly, gathering their architectural blueprints and financial projections. "Wait, please, this is just a minor administrative misunderstanding," my father pleaded, a thick layer of raw panic finally bleeding into his voice as he rushed around the massive table to block their exit. We can sort this out right now in my office." The seasoned investors expertly bypassed him without offering a single handshake or a backward glance. The heavy boardroom doors clicked shut behind them, instantly reducing my family's grand destructive casino empire into nothing more than worthless dust hanging in the silent air. The distinct sound of the final luxury SUV accelerating down the long gravel driveway gave way to a suffocating heavy silence that enveloped the three individuals who had just been violently stripped of all their power. The grand boardroom, previously buzzing with the arrogant energy of a multi-million-dollar casino negotiation, now felt as vast and empty as a tomb. Stripped of his unearned authority and the protective backing of the real estate syndicate, Shane's manufactured bravado instantly crumbled. He frantically flipped through the pages of the court injunction I had thrown onto the table, the color rapidly draining from his face until he was completely pale. His hands shook violently as his eyes darted across the severe legal terminology, finally comprehending the absolute permanence of his downfall. My parents immediately began the pathetic, agonizing process of psychological collapse. Initially, they violently rejected the reality of the situation. My father pointed an unsteady finger at Arthur, aggressively threatening to file a massive countersuit for corporate sabotage. When the chief financial officer simply ignored him and began calmly packing his briefcase, their denial rapidly morphed into desperate rationalization. My mother took a tentative step toward me, her voice trembling as she attempted to paint their malicious betrayal as a tragic misunderstanding, claiming they had simply wanted to give me some space to grieve in peace. When I did not offer a single word of comfort, the facade fully shattered. They resorted to begging. My mother openly wept, shamelessly weaponizing our shared bloodline, desperately pleading with me to rescind the judicial order and keep the family intact. I simply stared at them, my expression completely devoid of any warmth or familial affection. The burning anger that had consumed me for the past 2 days had entirely evaporated, leaving behind a profound, impenetrable wall of ice. They had not considered our bloodline when they tossed my suitcase onto the scorching desert pavement. They had not hesitated to erase my entire existence to build a gambling empire over Martha's grave. I did not need to scream, nor did I need to physically throw them out myself. The flawlessly executed legal trap had already done the heavy lifting. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, the rhythmic flashing of bright blue and red lights began to illuminate the darkening Sedona sky. A heavily marked county sheriff's cruiser pulled to a smooth stop directly in front of the main portico. 2 uniformed deputies stepped out, adjusting their utility belts as they approached the entrance. They were not there to mediate a domestic dispute. They were there to enforce the law. The lead deputy entered the boardroom, his hand resting casually on his radio, and officially served my parents and brother with the court-mandated eviction notice. He delivered the instructions with cold, bureaucratic efficiency. They had exactly 20 minutes to gather essential clothing and personal identification under strict law enforcement supervision. Any attempt to remove corporate documents, valuables, or assets belonging to the estate would result in immediate arrest. I stood silently by the massive stone fireplace, my arms crossed over my chest, watching the chaotic, humiliating reality unfold. The 3 individuals who had celebrated my supposed homelessness just 48 hours prior were now being aggressively escorted through the corridors of the mansion they thought they owned. They emerged into the cool night air carrying nothing but hastily stuffed duffel bags, their heads bowed in absolute defeat. They did not look back as they were directed toward a waiting taxi the deputies had summoned. I watched the taillights fade into the pitch-black desert night, carrying away the toxic anchor that had dragged down my grandmother's legacy for decades. The heavy oak doors of the estate clicked firmly shut once more. But this time, I was the one standing on the inside, completely alone, yet undeniably sovereign. We live in a world that often pressures us to endlessly forgive toxic family members simply because we share the same DNA. However, This story powerfully illustrates that blood does not automatically grant someone a free pass to exploit abuse and discard you. The ultimate lesson here is the profound reality of karma, delivered not by fate, but through meticulous boundaries and absolute self-respect. True justice is sometimes entirely devoid of reconciliation. What is your perspective on cutting ties with toxic relatives? Have you ever had to enforce severe boundaries to protect your own peace and legacy? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.